Xuanzang, pilgrim, translator and legend. Between history and myth on the Silk Road. Introduction and summary of the essay, Xuanzang and the Foreign Country of the Past. The past, as the novelist L.P. Hartley famously observed, is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Few documents illustrate this truth more vividly than the travel records of Xuanzang, the 7th century Chinese Buddhist monk who spent 16 years traversing the Silk Road from China to India and back. When he set out in 629 CE, illegally, evading an imperial ban on foreign travel, he entered a world that would seem almost unimaginably strange to modern readers, a world of oasis kingdoms ruled by Buddhist kings, of Zoroastrian fire temples standing alongside Nestorian Christian churches, of Turkic nomads governing ancient Iranian cities, and of colossal Buddhas carved into mountain cliffs that would stand for 13 centuries before their destruction in our own time. Xuanzang journeyed through a Central Asia that has since vanished. In the Tarim Basin, he passed through the kingdom of Kucha, where according to his account, the language was different from that of other countries, the writing system borrowed from India, and the people practiced a form of Buddhism that traced its lineage to the Sarvastivada school. In Samarkand, he found a Sogdian city where Zoroastrianism dominated, where the people were skilled merchants who travelled to all lands, and where Buddhist temples lay abandoned until his own intervention persuaded the local king to revive them. In Bactria, modern northern Afghanistan, he described a landscape dotted with hundreds of monasteries, the legacy of centuries of Kushan patronage, even as Turkic dynasties established new political control over the region. The languages he encountered were as diverse as the religions: Sanskrit in the monasteries, Sogdian along the trade routes, Bactrian in the courts of former Hellenistic kingdoms, Turkic among the newly arrived steppe confederations, and Middle Persian in the Zoroastrian temples. Xuanzang himself, the son of a Confucian scholar from Henan, had to learn Sanskrit and likely acquired facility in several of these languages through sheer necessity. What makes Xuanzang's record extraordinary is not merely its scope, but its perspective. He was not a conqueror or a diplomat, but a pilgrim, a man who crossed some of the world's most forbidding terrain in search of Buddhist scriptures. Yet he recorded everything with the precision of a scholar and the curiosity of an ethnographer. His Great Tang records on the western regions describes not only the monasteries and stupas that were his primary destinations, but also the climate, the crops, the political structures, the languages, the customs, and the moral character of the peoples he encountered. He noted, for instance, that in the kingdom of Kapisa, near modern Kabul, the ruling elite were Turks, a recent arrival from the steppes, while the common people followed customs he identified as Indian. He observed that in Gandhara, once the heartland of Greco-Buddhist civilization, the monasteries had fallen into decline, their endowments plundered, their communities diminished, the great stupas of the Kushan emperors now standing amidst ruins. He recorded that in the Swat Valley, Buddhism remained vigorous, with thousands of monks studying both Mahayana and Hinayana texts, while in the plains of the Indus, Hindu temples and Buddhist monasteries coexisted under the patronage of kings who often patronized multiple traditions. To read Xuanzang today is to encounter a world that is irrevocably lost. The Buddhist monasteries of Balkh are gone, their libraries scattered, their stupas reduced to earth. The giant Buddhas of Bamiyan, which he described as adorned with gold and jewels, were dynamited in 2001, leaving only empty niches in the cliff face. The great University of Nalanda, where he studied for years under the master Silabhadra, was sacked by invaders in the 12th century and remained abandoned until archaeological excavations confirmed the accuracy of his descriptions. The languages he heard spoken, Sogdian, Bactrian, Khotanese, Gandhari Prakrit, are all extinct, surviving only in manuscripts and inscriptions. The political order he navigated, Turkic khaganates, Hephthalite's successor states, the empire of Harsha in northern India, has been overlaid by a millennium and a half of subsequent conquests, empires, and nation-states. Yet Xuanzang's account endures, a rare window into a world in transformation. He was present at a moment when Central Asia was shifting from Buddhist to Islamic dominance, a process that would accelerate dramatically in the centuries after his journey, but which was only beginning in his own time. He witnessed the last flourishing of Buddhist civilization in Afghanistan and Pakistan, recording its vitality even as he noted signs of decline. He documented the arrival of Turkic peoples who would, in later centuries, become the ruling elite of much of the Islamic world, but who, in his time, were still establishing their presence as patrons of Buddhist monasteries and Zoroastrian fire temples alike. The past, indeed, is another country. Xuanzang walked through it with open eyes, and because he did, we can see it too, through his words, across the gulf of 14 centuries. This essay follows his journey, tracing his path through the lands that are now Afghanistan and Pakistan, and exploring what his account reveals about a world that was, in his own time, already ancient, and that is now almost entirely gone. It also traces the transformation of Xuanzang himself, from the historical scholar who returned to China with 657 Sanskrit texts and translated them into Chinese, to the legendary pilgrim of Journey to the West, protected by the Monkey King and his other disciples, whose adventures have become one of the great enduring myths of East Asian culture. Between these two Xuanzangs, the chronicler and the legend, we may glimpse something of how the past is both preserved and transformed, remembered and reimagined, across generations. Xuanzang, the background. Xuanzang, 602 to 664 CE, stands as one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of Buddhism, cross-cultural exchange, and Silk Road exploration. Born into a scholarly family in Henan during the Sui dynasty, he became a fully ordained Buddhist monk by age 20, only to find himself troubled by discrepancies and incomplete translations within the Chinese Buddhist canon. Defying an imperial ban on foreign travel, he embarked in 629 CE on a 16-year, 10,000-mile pilgrimage to India, the birthplace of Buddhism, to obtain original Sanskrit texts and resolve doctrinal contradictions. His journey took him through the oasis kingdoms of the Taklamakan Desert, the Sogdian cities of Central Asia, the Buddhist centres of Bactria, a modern Afghanistan, the fading Greco-Buddhist landscapes of Gandhara and Taxila, modern Pakistan, and finally into the Indian subcontinent, where he spent over a decade studying at Nalanda Monastery. Upon his return in 645 CE, he devoted the remaining 19 years of his life to translating 75 Sanskrit texts into Chinese and dictating the Great Tang records on the Western regions, a 12-volume masterpiece that remains one of the few primary sources on the peoples, cultures, and politics of 7th century Central Asia. Yet Xuanzang's story did not end with his death in 664 CE. Over the subsequent centuries, historical fact fused with popular legend, culminating in the Ming Dynasty novel Journey to the West, which transformed the erudite scholar into the pious Tripitaka, a divine pilgrim protected by the Monkey King and other mythical companions. This essay charts a course between the earliest, most reliable accounts of Xuanzang's life and the historical realities he encountered, particularly on his perilous journey through the lands of modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. It argues that Xuanzang's legacy operates on two levels: as an indispensable historical source documenting a world in transformation, and as a cultural icon whose legendary form has become far more recognizable than the historical figure. The tension between these two legacies, the meticulous chronicler and the mythic pilgrim, reveals much about how pre-modern religious figures are remembered, repurposed, and reshaped across generations. The man and the myth. In the collective imagination of East Asia, few figures are as instantly recognizable as the Buddhist monk Xuanzang. He appears in films, television dramas, comic books, video games, and high school textbooks, always depicted as the pious, resolute traveller, often accompanied by the mischievous Monkey King and a ragtag band of disciples, battling demons and overcoming supernatural obstacles in a quest for sacred scriptures. This Xuanzang is a cultural archetype, the embodiment of determination, faith, and self-sacrifice. Yet the historical Xuanzang, the 7th century scholar, translator, and chronicler, was a figure of equally remarkable proportions, though his achievements were of a different order. He was not a divine pilgrim protected by magical companions, but a solitary monk who defied an emperor's ban, crossed some of the world's most forbidding terrain, spent 16 years mastering Sanskrit philosophy, and returned to China to translate 75 works totaling 1,335 chapters, laying the foundations for the Yogacara school of Buddhism. The divergence between these two Xuanzangs, the historical and the legendary, is not merely a matter of scholarly pedantry. It represents a fundamental process in the transmission of pre-modern religious figures, the gradual accretion of myth, the repurposing of biography for devotional and literary ends, and the eventual eclipse of historical complexity by iconic simplicity. As with many such figures, the legends surrounding Xuanzang's life have been retold, reshaped, and repurposed by generations of devotees, historians, salespeople, and entertainers. The iconic form of the pious traveller is now far more recognizable and influential than the erudite court cleric who devoted his life to studying Buddhist doctrine and translating Sanskrit texts. This essay charts a course between these two Xuanzangs. It draws on the earliest and most reliable accounts of his life, primarily his own Great Tang records on the western regions, the Tang Xiuji, and the biography compiled by his disciple, Huili, The Life of Xuanzang, Datang Datien Si Sanzang Fashi Zhuan, to reconstruct his journey, his motivations, and the historical realities he encountered. Particular attention is paid to his passage through the lands of modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, regions in the grip of profound transformation during the 7th century. At the same time, the essay traces the process by which the historical Xuanzang was transformed into the legendary Tripitaka, culminating in the 16th century novel Journey to the West, Xiuji, and its countless adaptations. The result is a portrait of a figure who stands at the intersection of history and myth, scholarship and devotion, China and India, a figure whose enduring significance lies not only in what he accomplished, but also in what subsequent generations have made of him. Part 1. Early Life and the Call to Pilgrimage, 602 to 629 CE. Scholarly origins in a time of turmoil. Xuanzang was born in 602 CE in Chenlu, modern-day Chenhe village in Yanxi district near Luoyang, Henan province, during the Sui dynasty, a period of political consolidation following centuries of division. His birth name was Chen Hui, or Chen Yi, sources vary, and he came from a family of considerable scholarly distinction. His grandfather had served as a palace official. His father, Chen Hui, was a local magistrate who resigned his post in the face of political turmoil and devoted himself to Confucian scholarship. The young Xuanzang received a rigorous classical education under his father's tutelage, learning the Confucian canon and developing the disciplined intellectual habits that would characterize his entire life. The political landscape of Xuanzang's childhood was turbulent. The Sui dynasty, which had reunified China in 589 CE after nearly 4 centuries of division, collapsed in a series of rebellions and civil wars during Xuanzang's early adolescence. The future Tang dynasty's founding emperor, Li Yuan, Emperor Gaozu, seized power in 618 CE, but consolidation was gradual and violence persisted. It was amid this instability that Xuanzang, at the age of 13, followed his older brother, a Buddhist monk, into monastic life. The decision may have been influenced by the chaos around him, but Xuanzang's own writings suggest a genuine intellectual and spiritual calling. He was ordained as a novice at Jingtu Monastery in Luoyang, and later, after fleeing further unrest, he travelled with his brother to Chengdu in Sichuan province, where he completed his full ordination as a bhiksu, fully ordained monk, in 622 CE at the age of 20. The search for doctrinal clarity. By his early 20s, Xuanzang had settled in Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, Shanxi province, the capital of the newly consolidated Tang dynasty. Chang'an was one of the world's largest and most cosmopolitan cities, a terminus of the Silk Road where merchants, monks, and diplomats from across Asia converged. It was here that Xuanzang immersed himself in the study of Buddhist scriptures, learning Sanskrit and other foreign languages from the many Central Asian and Indian monks who resided in the city's monasteries. The Buddhist canon available in China in the 7th century was extensive but deeply problematic. Translations were often incomplete. The quality varied dramatically depending on the linguistic competence of the translators, and, most troubling for a scholar of Xuanzang's temperament, there were significant doctrinal contradictions between texts. The Mahayana and Hinayana schools were represented by different translation traditions, and even within the Mahayana corpus, there were competing interpretations of core philosophical concepts such as Tathagatagarbha, Buddha nature, and Vijñapti Matra, consciousness only. Xuanzang found himself unable to reconcile these discrepancies, and he became convinced that only by studying in India, the birthplace of Buddhism, could he obtain original Sanskrit texts and resolve the contradictions that plagued his understanding. The decision to undertake such a journey was not without precedent. Earlier Chinese pilgrims, most notably Faxian, 337 to 422 CE, had travelled to India in search of scriptures. But Faxian's journey had occurred during a period when the overland routes were relatively stable. Xuanzang's proposed pilgrimage, by contrast, faced an immediate and seemingly insurmountable obstacle. The Tang Emperor Tang Taizong reigned. 626 to 649 had banned foreign travel on security grounds due to ongoing conflicts with Turkic peoples of the steppe. The western frontiers were closed. Anyone attempting to leave Chinese territory without imperial permission risked severe punishment. Xuanzang's response to this obstacle reveals much about his character. According to his biographer Huili, he experienced a powerful dream that convinced him of his mission's spiritual necessity. Inspired by this vision, he resolved to go regardless of the legal consequences. In 629 CE, at the age of 27, he slipped out of Chang'an by night, evading border guards and beginning what would become a 16-year, approximately 10,000-mile odyssey across some of the world's most forbidding terrain. Part 2. The Outward Journey. From China to Central Asia, 629 to 631 CE. Through the Hexi Corridor and into the oases. Xuanzang's initial route followed the northern Silk Road through the Hexi Corridor, the narrow passage between the Tibetan Plateau and the Gobi Desert that connected China proper to the western regions. Travelling by night to avoid detection, he reached Liangzhou, modern Wuwei, Gansu province, the western frontier gateway where the route skirted the southern edge of the Taklamakan Desert. Here, despite his fugitive status, he spent a month preaching to local Buddhist communities, an indication that even in his early years, his reputation as a scholar had preceded him. Word of Xuanzang's presence reached the king of Turfan, Gaochang, a devout Buddhist ruler of a prosperous oasis kingdom. The king sent an escort to bring the pilgrim to his court, and Xuanzang, still navigating the complexities of his illegal departure, accepted. He arrived in Turfan to a lavish reception. The king, whose name is recorded as Kuwentai, was so impressed by the young monk that he attempted to detain him permanently, offering to install him as the ecclesiastical head of his court. Xuanzang refused, and when the king persisted, he staged a dramatic hunger strike, refusing all food until he was allowed to continue. The king relented but extracted a promise. Xuanzang would return to Turfan on his way back to China and spend 3 years preaching. The king also provided letters of introduction to rulers along the route, including the powerful Western Turk Khagan, whose confederation controlled vast territories from the Tian Shan to the Oxus. No longer a fugitive, Xuanzang was now a pilgrim with official standing. From Turfan, Xuanzang pressed westward through the harsh desert landscapes of Xinjiang. His route took him to Hami, Kumul, Agni, modern Yanqi, Kucha, Kuka, and Aksu, oases that had been centers of Buddhism since the early centuries of the Common Era. At Kucha, he encountered a thriving Sarvastivada tradition. The monasteries he described housed thousands of monks and possessed extensive libraries of Sanskrit manuscripts. The journey through these regions was perilous. Xuanzang faced bandits, extreme temperatures, and the ever-present threat of thirst in the desert crossings. But he also found communities of fellow Buddhists who provided shelter, provisions, and guidance for the next stage of his journey. Sogdiana and the encounter with Zoroastrianism. Crossing the Tian Shan range, Xuanzang entered Sogdiana, the region of Central Asia, modern Uzbekistan and parts of Tajikistan, that was home to the Sogdians, a people of Iranian origin who dominated Silk Road trade for centuries. He spent time in Samarkand, the region's most prominent city, which was then under Western Turkic control, but retained its Sogdian character. Xuanzang's account of his time in Samarkand is revealing both for what it says about the religious landscape of Central Asia and for the ways in which his narrative may reflect diplomatic considerations. He describes going in search of Buddhist temples, only to find them abandoned and neglected. When he and his disciples visited one of the few remaining monasteries, a group of local Zoroastrians, practitioners of Mazdaism, attacked his disciples. Xuanzang gained an audience with the king of Samarkand, who punished the attackers and allowed the pilgrim to hold a public assembly at which he ordained a number of new monks. This episode, while presented in Xuanzang's account as a straightforward spiritual victory, should be read with caution. As scholars of the Silk Road have noted, Samarkand in the 630s was a complex political environment. The Western Turkic Khaganate was undergoing internal tensions, and local rulers were maneuvering to maintain their autonomy. The king of Samarkand may have had strategic reasons to cultivate Xuanzang, who, as a Chinese monk with connections to the Tang court, could serve as a diplomatic asset. By facilitating Buddhist ordinations and punishing Zoroastrians who had attacked the Pilgrims' Party, the king could signal his alignment with the rising power of Tang China against Turkic factions. The account, in other words, is likely a mixture of historical fact and political narrative, shaped by Xuanzang's own diplomatic awareness and his desire to present his journey as a series of spiritual triumphs. Bactria, the Buddhist heartland of Central Asia. Heading south from Samarkand, Xuanzang crossed the Oxus River, Amu Darya, and entered Bactria, spanning modern southern Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and northern Afghanistan. This region had been a major center of Buddhism since the Kushan period, 1st to 5th century CE, and Xuanzang's first major stop was the great city of Balkh, the ancient capital of Bactria. Balkh, which Xuanzang described as a thriving center of Buddhism, was home to over 100 monasteries and some 3,000 monks of the Theravada school. He was particularly awed by the Nalanda, new monastery, a massive Buddhist complex that served as a major center of learning and pilgrimage. He meticulously recorded its numerous relics, including a sacred vessel of the Buddha and a famous well whose waters were said to have healing properties. The name Nalanda would later become the etymological source of the word Navbahar, used in Persian and Arabic sources to refer to Buddhist monasteries, a testament to the enduring memory of Buddhism in this region even after its decline. From Balkh, Xuanzang travelled eastward along the northern foothills of the Hindu Kush, passing through territory that had once been part of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom and later the Kushan Empire. By the 7th century, the political landscape had been transformed by successive waves of invasions. The Hephthalites, White Huns, had overrun the region in the 5th and 6th centuries, followed by Turkic expansion from the north. The Buddhist institutions that Xuanzang encountered were still vibrant, but they existed within a political framework dominated by Turkic and Hephthalite successor states. Part 3: Afghanistan and Pakistan. A world in transformation, 631 CE. Kapisa and the Turkic ruling elite. Travelling east from Balkh, Xuanzang entered the mountainous realm of Kapisa, a kingdom that stretched from the Hindu Kush to the Kabul Valley. The political landscape he encountered was one of transition and diversity, and his account provides one of the few surviving glimpses into this complex period. The ruling elite of Kapisa, Xuanzang noted, was a Turkic dynasty, part of a broader westward expansion of Turkic peoples from Central Asia who had established themselves in the region, sometimes ruling alongside or in place of earlier Hephthalite rulers. The king of Kapisa he described as a kshatriya, warrior class by caste, known for his shrewd and ambitious character, having subjugated some 10 neighbouring states. Xuanzang found the local people to be cruel and fierce in temperament, with a coarse and rude language, and their customs distinct from those of the Indian subcontinent. Despite these cultural differences, and the political dominance of a Turkic elite whose religious affiliations were likely a mixture of Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and traditional steppe beliefs, Buddhism was flourishing under royal patronage. Xuanzang recorded that the kingdom had over 6,000 monks, all belonging to the Mahayana school. The king himself, whatever his personal beliefs, supported the monasteries and allowed Buddhist practice to continue. Xuanzang's account of Kapisa is significant for what it reveals about the dynamics of religious and political life in 7th century Afghanistan. The region had been a crossroads of empires for centuries: Achaemenid, Greco-Bactrian, Kushan, Sasanian, Hephthalite, and the Turkic rulers who now held power were the latest in a long succession of outside groups to establish dominance. Yet Buddhism persisted, its institutions sustained by a combination of royal patronage, local devotion, and the economic resources generated by Silk Road trade. The image that emerges is not one of decline, but of adaptation. Buddhist communities navigating a complex political environment, maintaining their traditions while accommodating new rulers and new cultural influences. Bamiyan, the colossal Buddhas. From Kapisa, Xuanzang travelled through the Kabul Valley, passing through territory that had once been part of Gandhara. His route took him past the giant rock-cut Buddhas of Bamiyan, which he described with wonder in his records. The two colossal figures, the Western Buddha standing approximately 175 feet, 55 metres tall, the Eastern around 120 feet, 38 metres, were, according to Xuanzang, adorned with dazzling golden ornaments and surrounded by vibrant monastic communities. Xuanzang's description of Bamiyan is among the most important eyewitness accounts of these now destroyed monuments. He notes that the Buddhas were carved into the cliffs of the Bamiyan Valley, a site that had been a major Buddhist pilgrimage centre since the Kushan period. The statues were not isolated works of art, but part of a larger complex that included monasteries, shrines, and caves decorated with murals depicting Buddhist narratives. Xuanzang's account captures a moment when Bamiyan was at its height, a thriving centre of Buddhist art and learning that attracted pilgrims from across Asia. The destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas by the Taliban in 2001 gave Xuanzang's account a tragic resonance. What he described with such care, the golden adornments, the monastic communities, the devotion of pilgrims, survives now only in texts, photographs, and the ruined cavities left in the cliff face. Xuanzang's words have become a vital source for scholars seeking to reconstruct the site as it existed before its destruction. Gandhara, the fading heartland. Continuing his journey, Xuanzang entered Gandhara, the ancient heartland of Greco-Buddhist art that had once been the centre of the Kushan Empire. By the 7th century, however, Gandhara's golden age had long since passed. The region had been devastated by the Hepthalite invasions in the 5th century, and its great cities, Purushapura, Peshawar, Taxila, had lost much of their former prosperity. At Purushapura, Xuanzang viewed the great stupa built by the Kushan emperor Kanishka in the 2nd century CE. The stupa, which had once been one of the tallest structures in the ancient world, was still standing. But Xuanzang's description conveys a sense of decline. The monument was impressive, but the city around it was no longer the vibrant capital it had been under Kushan rule. The monasteries, though still active, housed fewer monks than in their heyday, and many of the great Buddhist institutions that had made Gandhara a centre of learning had been abandoned. The political landscape of Gandhara was as fragmented as its religious institutions. The region was controlled by the Turk Shahi dynasty, which had supplanted the Nezak Huns, the last Hepthalite successor state, and ruled from Kabul and Kapisa. This was a period of profound political change and instability, with new Turkic rulers consolidating power over ancient but decaying Buddhist centres. Xuanzang's account captures a moment of transition. The Buddhist civilization that had flourished for centuries was still present, but it was no longer the dominant force it had once been. Further south, Xuanzang reached Taxila, near modern Islamabad. Once a celebrated centre of learning and a capital of the Mauryan and Kushan empires, he found it now a shadow of its former glory. The great city, which had been visited by Alexander the Great's armies centuries earlier, had lost its political significance and lay in ruins. Xuanzang's description of Taxila is among the last surviving accounts of the city before its final abandonment. It stands as a testament to the impermanence that lay at the heart of Buddhist teaching. Finally, Xuanzang crossed the Indus River. He had travelled through lands in the grip of transformation, witnessing the decline of ancient Buddhist civilizations and the rise of new Turkic dynasties, and was about to enter the Indian subcontinent proper. The journey thus far had been perilous, but the most productive phase of his pilgrimage was still to come. Part 4. The Indian Sojourn. Study, Debate and Collection. 631 to 643 CE. A decade of study. Xuanzang spent over a decade in India, travelling extensively across what are now Pakistan, India, Nepal and Bangladesh. His itinerary included many of the most important Buddhist sites of the subcontinent. Kashmir, where he studied for 2 years at Jayendra Monastery with thousands of monks. The Swat Valley, Udayana, which had been a centre of Buddhist art. Mathura, the great pilgrimage centre. Kanauj, Kanyakubja, the capital of Emperor Harsha. Prayaga, modern Prayagraj, where the Buddha was said to have preached. Shravasti, Kapilavastu, Kushinagara, Varanasi, Sarnath, Vaishali, and Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. Throughout his travels, Xuanzang documented the state of Buddhism in the various regions he visited. He observed the coexistence of Mahayana and Hinayana traditions, the presence of Hindu temples and Jain shrines alongside Buddhist monasteries, and the varying fortunes of Buddhist institutions under different rulers. He also engaged in religious and philosophical debates with Hindu Brahmins, Jains, and members of rival Buddhist schools, debates that enhanced his reputation as a scholar and allowed him to refine his understanding of Buddhist doctrine. Nalanda, the apex of Buddhist learning. The pinnacle of Xuanzang's Indian sojourn was his extended stay at Nalanda Monastery, located near modern Rajgir in Bihar, India. Nalanda was the world's oldest university-like institution, a vast complex that housed over 10,000 monks and scholars from across Asia. Its library, known as the Dharma Gunja, Mountain of Truth, contained hundreds of thousands of volumes, making it one of the largest collections of Buddhist texts in the world. At Nalanda, Xuanzang studied under the master Silabhadra, a renowned scholar of the Yogacara, consciousness-only school. He immersed himself in Yogacara philosophy, logic, grammar, and Sanskrit, and he participated in philosophical tournaments that tested his knowledge against other scholars. He also collected relics, statues, and manuscripts, the fruits of his pilgrimage that he would later transport back to China. Xuanzang's time at Nalanda was not limited to study. He also travelled extensively from Nalanda to other parts of India, including Kanchipuram in Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Malwa, and the regions that are now Odisha and Bangladesh. Throughout these journeys, he observed the religious and political landscapes, documenting the fortunes of Buddhism under rulers such as Emperor Harsha of Kanauj, who convened a great assembly that Xuanzang attended. The Return Journey. In 643 CE, Xuanzang began his return journey to China. He carried with him an immense collection, 657 Sanskrit texts, transported on 20 horses, along with relics, statues, and other objects of devotion. His reputation had preceded him, and he travelled with the permission of the Tang Emperor, who had, by this time, become aware of the pilgrim's achievements. Xuanzang's return route retraced parts of his outward journey, but he took a different path through Central Asia, travelling via the Khyber Pass, through Afghanistan and Pakistan, then northward via Kashgar, Xinjiang, Yarkand, Khotan, Hotan, Xinjiang, and the southern Silk Road around the Taklamakan Desert to Dunhuang, modern Dunhuang, Gansu. He arrived triumphantly in Chang'an in the first lunar month of 645 CE, nearly 16 years after his departure. The reception was extraordinary. Crowds lined the streets to welcome the returning pilgrim, and the emperor himself, who had originally banned foreign travel, now granted Xuanzang an audience and offered him high court positions. Xuanzang declined, his mission being not political but scholarly. He had returned with the texts he sought, and he was determined to devote the remainder of his life to translating them. Part 5. The Translator's Life. Scholarly Achievement and Lasting Legacy, 645 to 664 CE. The Translation Project. For the remaining 19 years of his life, Xuanzang dedicated himself to translation. He established a translation bureau at the newly built Daqian Temple, Great Compassionate Beneficence Temple, in Chang'an, assembling a team of scholars, monks and scribes to assist in the monumental task. Between 645 and 664 CE, he and his team rendered 75 distinct works, totaling 1,335 chapters, from Sanskrit into Chinese. Among the most significant texts he translated were the Mahaprajnaparamita Sutra, Great Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, in 600 chapters, the Heart Sutra, which became one of the most widely recited texts in East Asian Buddhism, and numerous Yogacara treatises that laid the foundation for the Faxiang, Dharma Characteristics, school, China's tradition of Yogacara philosophy. Xuanzang's translations were notable for their precision and consistency. He developed a sophisticated technical vocabulary for Buddhist philosophy that set a new standard for Chinese translation of Sanskrit texts. In addition to his translation work, Xuanzang wrote or dictated the Great Tang Records on the Western regions, Datang Siuji, completed in 646 CE. This 12-volume work is a masterpiece of geographical, historical, and ethnographic writing, describing in detail the kingdoms, cultures, religions, and political systems of the 110 regions he visited or heard about during his journey. The records provide one of the few surviving primary sources on the Sogdians, on the Buddhist institutions of Central Asia, and on the political situation in 7th century Afghanistan and Pakistan. They have also been invaluable for archaeologists, The descriptions of Nalanda, Rajgir, and other ancient sites guided later excavations that confirmed the accuracy of Xuanzang's accounts. The death of Xuanzang. Xuanzang died in 664 CE at Jade Flower Palace Monastery near Chang'an at the age of 61. According to his biographers, his death was marked by signs of his spiritual attainment, visions of celestial beings, the fragrance of incense, and other portents. He was given a state funeral, and his remains were interred with honour. The scale of his achievement was already recognised in his lifetime. He had brought to China the texts necessary to resolve the doctrinal contradictions that had troubled him in his youth. He had established a translation method that influenced generations of subsequent translators, and he had produced a geographical record that remains a foundational text for the study of Central Asian history. But his legacy was only beginning. Over the centuries that followed, Xuanzang would undergo a transformation that would make him one of the most recognizable figures in East Asian culture. Not as a translator or chronicler, but as a legendary pilgrim. Part 6. From History to Legend. The Making of a Myth. Early hagiography. The process of transforming Xuanzang from a historical figure into a legendary one began almost immediately after his death. His disciple Huili composed The Life of Xuanzang, Datang Datien Si Sanzang Fashi Juan, a biography that, while grounded in historical fact, already incorporated hagiographic elements. Xuanzang's dream, before his departure, his miraculous survival in the desert, and his debates with non-Buddhist opponents were presented in ways that emphasized his spiritual power and divine protection. These early accounts established a pattern that would continue for centuries. The historical facts of Xuanzang's life were preserved, but they were increasingly framed within a narrative of spiritual heroism. The emphasis shifted from his scholarly achievements, the translations, the commentaries, the philosophical debates, to his physical trials and his unwavering faith. The rise of popular narratives. As Buddhism became more deeply integrated into Chinese culture, stories about Xuanzang's journey began to circulate in popular literature. By the Tang dynasty, accounts of his pilgrimage had entered the repertoire of storytellers who embellished the narrative with supernatural elements. Demons, spirits, and divine protectors were introduced. The journey itself became a metaphor for the spiritual path, with each obstacle representing a particular temptation or delusion that the pilgrim must overcome. The most significant development in the legendary tradition came during the Song dynasty, 960 to 1279 CE, when Xuanzang's story began to be adapted for vernacular audiences. The historical figure, the erudite scholar, the meticulous translator, receded further into the background, replaced by a more accessible figure, the pious pilgrim who, despite his human weaknesses, perseveres in his quest for enlightenment. Journey to the West and the Triumph of Legend. The culmination of this process was the 16th century novel Journey to the West, Xiuji, traditionally attributed to Wu Cheng'an. This 100-chapter masterpiece is one of the 4 great classical novels of Chinese literature, and it permanently fixed the legendary Xuanzang, known in the novel as Tripitaka in the popular imagination. In Journey to the West, Xuanzang is a monk chosen by the Buddha to retrieve the scriptures from India. He is accompanied by 3 disciples, Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, Zhu Bajie, the Pixie, and Sha Wujing, the Sandy. Each of these disciples is a former celestial being who has been punished for transgressions and must earn redemption through service to the pilgrim. The journey becomes a series of episodic adventures, with the travellers encountering demons, spirits, and obstacles that represent various forms of temptation and spiritual danger. The Xuanzang of Journey to the West is a very different figure from the historical Xuanzang. He is often portrayed as naive, fearful, and overly trusting, qualities that contrast with the courage and determination of the historical pilgrim. He requires constant protection from his disciples, particularly Sun Wukong, who is the novel's true hero. The scholarly achievements of the historical Xuanzang, the translations, the commentaries, the philosophical debates, are entirely absent. What remains is the image of the pilgrim, the pious traveller who undertakes a perilous journey in pursuit of sacred texts. The legendary Xuanzang in modern culture. The influence of Journey to the West on East Asian culture cannot be overstated. The novel has been adapted into countless films, television series, comic books, video games, and stage productions. Sun Wukong has become a cultural icon in his own right, and the story's themes of perseverance, redemption, and spiritual transformation continue to resonate with audiences across Asia and beyond. In these adaptations, Xuanzang is almost always depicted in the terms established by the novel, as the pious but vulnerable Tripitaka, often a secondary figure to the more dynamic Monkey King. The historical Xuanzang, the scholar who mastered Sanskrit, who debated Hindu philosophers, who translated 1,335 chapters of Buddhist scripture, is largely forgotten outside academic circles. This is not to say that the legendary Xuanzang has no value. The mythic figure has inspired generations of Buddhists and non-Buddhists alike, embodying ideals of faith, perseverance, and self-sacrifice. But the eclipse of the historical Xuanzang by his legendary counterpart represents a loss as well as a gain. The historical Xuanzang's achievements, as a translator, a chronicler, a philosopher, were extraordinary, and they had consequences that the legendary figure could not encompass. The Great Tang Records remains an indispensable source for historians. The translations established a canon that shaped East Asian Buddhism for a millennium. The Yogacara tradition he transmitted influenced philosophical developments across the region. Conclusion: two Xuanzangs. The story of Xuanzang is thus the story of two figures. The historical monk who journeyed to India, mastered Sanskrit philosophy, and devoted his life to translation, and the legendary pilgrim who, over centuries of retelling, became a character in one of the world's great literary epics. The two Xuanzangs are not entirely separate. The legend grew out of the history, preserving certain elements while transforming others. But the gap between them is wide enough that we must be careful not to conflate them. For the historian, Xuanzang remains invaluable as a primary source. His Great Tang Records on the Western regions provides one of the few eyewitness accounts of 7th century Central Asia, documenting the political transformations, religious landscapes, and cultural dynamics of a world in flux. His descriptions of Bactria, Kapisa, Bamiyan, Gandhara, and Taxila are essential for understanding the Buddhist civilizations of Afghanistan and Pakistan during a period of transition. Without his account, much of what we know about these regions would be lost. For the student of religion and literature, the legendary Xuanzang offers a window into processes of hagiographic transformation, how a historical figure is gradually reshaped to serve devotional, didactic, and entertainment purposes. The trajectory from Huili's biography to Journey to the West illustrates the ways in which religious narratives evolve across generations, adapting to changing cultural contexts and audience expectations. For both historians and literary scholars, however, the two Xuanzangs are not mutually exclusive. The historical Xuanzang is not diminished by the existence of his legendary counterpart. Rather, the two figures together illuminate different aspects of how the past is remembered and repurposed. The historical monk achieved things that no legendary figure could match. He learned Sanskrit, debated philosophers, translated scriptures, and produced a geographical record of enduring value. The legendary pilgrim achieved something different. He entered the cultural imagination of East Asia, becoming a symbol of faith and perseverance that continues to inspire. The tension between these two Xuanzangs, the meticulous chronicler and the mythic pilgrim, reveals something essential about the transmission of pre-modern religious figures. Collective beliefs conjure their own realities, and the legendary Xuanzang has become as influential as the historical monk who devoted his life to doctrine and translation. But the historical Xuanzang, the scholar who slipped out of Chang'an in 629 CE with nothing but his conviction, remains a figure of extraordinary achievement, a testament to what one person, armed with intellectual discipline and unwavering purpose, could accomplish on the ancient Silk Road. His journey through the lands of modern-day China, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India bridged empires and eras. In an age of transformation, his eyewitness accounts preserve a vanished world, the Buddhist centers of Bamiyan, the monasteries of Balkh, the ruins of Taxila, the grandeur of Nalanda. His translations brought the philosophical heritage of Indian Buddhism to East Asia, shaping religious practice for centuries, and his story, in both its historical and legendary forms, reminds us that one monk's quest for truth could reshape religions, literatures, and histories across a continent. Xuanzang died in 664 CE, but his legacy lives on in two forms: the historical legacy of the scholar and translator, preserved in the texts he translated and the account he wrote, and the legendary legacy of the pilgrim, preserved in the stories told about him for over 1,000 years. Both are worth remembering. The historical Xuanzang achieved what he set out to achieve. He brought the Buddhist canon to China, resolved doctrinal contradictions, and laid foundations for generations of scholarship. The legendary Xuanzang achieved something he never sought. He became a cultural icon, a symbol of perseverance, and a character whose adventures continue to entertain and inspire. Between these two Xuanzangs lies the full richness of his legacy, a legacy that spans history and myth, scholarship and devotion, China and India, and the Silk Road that connected them.